I want to introduce you to two types of brain scan readings so that you can see and understand the changes I'm about to show you. Let's make it simple. The first type of scan we used measures degrees of activity between brain areas. See figure 10.2, located along with the rest of the figures for this chapter in the full color insert pages. The scans map two relative types of this activity. Hyperactivity, or overregulation, is depicted by red lines connecting different locations in the brain. Imagine telephone lines connecting one place to another in order to establish communication between those areas. Having too many red lines at any one time indicates too much action taking place within the brain. Hypoactivity, lack of regulation, is depicted by blue lines, indicating that minimal information is being communicated between the different brain areas. The thickness of the lines represent the standard deviation, or how much dysregulation, or abnormal regulation, exists between the two locations the line connects. For example, the thin red lines indicate that the level of activity between those locations is 1.96 standard deviations, SD, above normal. The thin blue lines indicate that the level of activity between those locations is 1.96 SD below normal. The medium lines indicate 2.58 SD, either above red or below blue normal. And the thick lines indicate 3.09 SD, above or below normal. So when you see a lot of thick red lines in a scan, it means the brain is working too hard. When you see a lot of thick blue lines, it suggests there's little communication between different areas of the brain, and therefore the brain is underactive. Think of it like this. The thicker the red line, the higher the volume of data the brain is processing, and the thicker the blue line, the lower the volume of data the brain is processing. The second type of scan we used comes from the QEEG analysis and is called a Z-score report. Z-score is a statistical measure that tells us not only whether a point is above or below average, but also how far from normal the measurement is. The scale on this report ranges from -3 to +3 SD. The darker blue represents 3 or more SD below normal, while the lighter blues range from about 2.5 to 1 SD below normal. Blue-green is approximately 0 to 1 SD below normal, while green is baseline normal. Light green registers at the outer area of normal, but is considered from 0 to 1 SD above normal, while yellow and light orange are approximately 1 to 2 SD above normal. Darker orange is about 2 to 2.5 SD above normal, and red is 3 or more SD above normal. See figure 10.3. The Z-score report that will be used is called relative power, and it shows information about the amount of energy in the brain at different frequencies. Because green, as explained previously, indicates the normal range, the more green there is in a scan, the more the person is conforming to normal brainwave activity. Each colored circle, resembling a person's head when viewed from the top, represents what one person's brain is doing at each brainwave frequency. The circle in the upper left region of each scan shows the lowest brainwave frequency in delta brainwaves, and each circle after that depicts a higher and higher brainwave state, moving progressively up to the highest beta brainwaves at the bottom right region. A cycle per second in brainwave frequency is known as Hertz or Hz. From left to right and from top to bottom, it progresses from 1 to 4 cycles per second, delta, to 4 to 8 cycles per second, theta, to 8 to 13 cycles per second, alpha, to 13 to 30 plus cycles per second, low, mid-range, and high-range beta. The beta activity can be broken down into different frequency bands, such as 12 to 15 Hz, 15 to 18 Hz, 18 to 25 Hz, and 25 to 30 Hz. Therefore, the relative colors in each area show what's happening in each different brainwave state. For example, a lot of blue in a majority of the brain in 1 cycle per second of delta suggests that there's little activity of the brain in that delta range. And if there's a lot of red in 14 Hz alpha in the frontal lobe, it means that there's heightened alpha activity in that area of the brain. It should also be understood that these measurements could be interpreted differently depending on what the subject is doing when the scan is taken. For example, if 1 Hz delta were depicted in blue, that would suggest that the energy in the brain at that frequency is 3 SD below normal. In a clinical sense, that might be interpreted as being abnormally low. But because it was recorded when the subject was meditating, such a scan would actually suggest that the 1 Hz delta had opened the door to a stronger connection to the collective conscious energy field. In other words, as the energy in the neocortex is turned way down, the autonomic nervous system is more readily accessed. In just a bit, you'll see several examples that will make all of this clear. In the meantime, glance at figure 10.3 again. It will give you an overview to illustrate what I've just explained. Now look at figure 10.4. The image to the left, labeled before meditation, represents a brain that has a lot of chatter. It's functioning in a high level of arousal, high-range beta, and is quite incoherent. The thickness of the red lines show that this brain is 3 SD above normal, because the thicker the red line, the more revved up and imbalanced the brain is. By looking at the red lines, you can see excessive, incoherent activity happening throughout the entire brain. The blue in the front of the brain represents hypoactivity, 2 to 3 SD below normal, in the frontal lobes, showing that the frontal lobes are shut down or turned off, and so aren't restraining the hyperactivity in the rest of the brain. This is a brain with attention problems. It's so overloaded that it has no leader to control the chatter. It's like a TV satellite system with 50 channels, where the volume is turned up really loud and the channels are changing every second. Too many quick shifts in attention span occur from one thought process to the next, so the brain is overly vigilant, highly aroused, overworked and overregulated. We call this an incoherent brain pattern, because the different parts of the brain are not working together at all. Now take a look at the second image, labeled after meditation. You don't have to be a neuroscientist to see the difference between the first image and this one. Here you see hardly any red or blue lines, demonstrating normal brain activity, with very little hyperactivity or hypoactivity. The chatter has stopped, and the brain is working more holistically. This person's brain is now in balance, so we can say that this brain demonstrates a more coherent pattern. The remaining activity in blue and red, as indicated by the arrow, represents sensory motor activity, which probably means the person is twitching or blinking and in a state of rapid eye movement, or REM, which typically happens in very light sleep. This change took place in one of the students after only one meditation. Now let's explore some more case studies of students from the workshops. For each, I'll first give you a bit of background so that you can see what state of being students were in when they began the workshop. Then I'll explain what their scans showed. And finally, I'll describe the new state of being each student created. Michelle's old self. Michelle is in her 60s and was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2011, after she noticed progressive involuntary shaking of her left arm, left hand and left foot. In November 2012, she became a patient at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix. Her attending physician told her that she had probably had Parkinson's for 10 to 15 years already, and that she'd have to live with the symptoms. The plan was to cope with the progression of the bodily limitations as she aged. She began taking Azilect, Razagoline mesylate, a medication used for Parkinson's disease that stops the uptake of dopamine at the receptor site level, slowing its breakdown in the body. The drug produced very few noticeable changes. Michelle became a student in November 2012. The month of December was outstanding. Her daily meditation routine brought a feeling of peace and joy, which began to reduce her symptoms to a noticeable degree. Michelle was certain that this course of action would assist her in overcoming Parkinson's. She continued experiencing great meditation sessions through early February 2013. In mid-February, however, Michelle's mother was admitted to intensive care in Sarasota, Florida, so Michelle flew to Florida to be with her. The day Michelle flew back to Arizona for our February 2013 workshop, her mother was placed in hospice care. Michelle's plane landed in Phoenix about an hour and a half before her first brain scan. Needless to say, she was both physically and emotionally exhausted at the time of the brain scan, which indeed showed the extreme stress she was experiencing. By the end of that workshop, she was certainly in a calmer, more positive state of being, with barely noticeable Parkinson's symptoms. Following the workshop, Michelle returned to Florida to be with her mother again. Although she and her mother always had a difficult relationship, As a result of her efforts in the workshop, Michelle felt sufficiently strengthened to be supportive, loving, and totally free of any old issues that could have interfered with the love she felt for her mother. Nevertheless, because of her mother's illness and eventual passing, as well as her sister in Texas having a major stroke, Michelle was forced to fly back and forth to Florida and Texas to deal with her family challenges. Her routine was greatly affected, and by June, she stopped doing her meditations. Life had gotten in the way, and she had too many responsibilities. Stopping her meditations was like stopping taking the placebo. When she noticed her symptoms returning, she started meditating again, and made significant strides. Michelle's scans. Because Michelle lives close to Dr. Fannon's clinic in Arizona, we were able to track her progress for more than 5 months by taking a series of 6 periodic brain scans. I want to explain her evolution during that time. Take a look at the before meditation part of figure 10.5. This is her scan at the February 2013 event, after she came home from Florida, stressed and exhausted from her mother's illness. The thick red lines indicate her brain in all areas is 3 SD from normal. She's displaying too much brain activity, hyper-incoherence and overregulation. In Parkinson's disease, this is quite common. The lack of proper neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine, causes the neurons to display an erratic communication system between each region of the brain, with neural networks firing out of control. The result is a type of spastic or hyperactive neuronal firing, which affects the brain and the body. As a result, involuntary motor functions interfere with normal movement. Now, review the after meditation part of the same figure. This is Michelle's brain after 4 days of changing her state of being during meditation. This is very close to a normal brain, with very little hyperactivity, incoherence, or overregulation. At the end of our event, she was experiencing no involuntary tremors, twitches, or motor problems, and her brain scan confirms this change. Now let's look at the QEEG readings in figure 10.6a, labeled Before Meditation. If you look from the middle of the second row, all the way to the last row, the image is in blue, you'll see that Michelle's brain is showing no alpha or beta brainwave functioning. Remember that blue means cooled off brain activity. With Parkinson's, this is typically represented by lessened cognitive activity, compromised learning, and a loss of engagement. Here you can see that Michelle can't consolidate new information. She has no ability to sustain an internal picture because she's not producing alpha brain waves. Her very low-range beta patterns also show that she's having difficulty with sustaining levels of awareness. All of the energy in her brain is going toward dealing with her hyper-incoherence. So it's like a light bulb going from 50 watts to 10 watts. The volume of energy in the brain is turned down. If you look at the after meditation part of the graphic, you'll see what looks like a much improved and balanced brain. All of those green areas in most of the images, indicated with arrows, represent normal and balanced brain activity. Her brain can now function in alpha, and she can move into internal states more easily, cope with stress better, and enter into the subconscious operating system to influence autonomic functions. Even her beta activity returned back to normal, green, indicating that she is more conscious, alert, and attentive. The balanced activity resulted in very few motor problems. The red areas circled at the bottom in higher range beta signify anxiety. This is the attitude that Michelle struggles with and is working on changing from an internal perspective. Coincidentally, anxiety is exactly what has amplified her Parkinson's symptoms in the past. As she lowers her anxiety, she lowers the symptoms of Parkinson's. To Michelle, her tremors now represent when she's out of balance in her life. When she regulates her internal states, she produces changes in her external reality. 3 months later, Michelle again had her brain scanned at Dr. Fannon's office. The May 9, 2013 scan, in figure 10.6b, still shows her brain improving, which is exactly what Michelle reported. She's still getting better in the midst of all the different stresses in her life. Because she does her meditations every day, think of it as taking her placebo daily, Michelle is continually changing her brain and body to be greater than the conditions in her environment. The scan shows that she's dropped almost another standard deviation from her previous scan at the bottom of the graph. You can clearly see that her anxiety is still getting better, and as a result, so is her condition. Less anxiety means fewer tremors. She's sustaining and thus memorizing that state of being for a longer period of time, and her brain is showing the changes. If you look at Michelle's brain scan from June 3, 2013, in figure 10.6c, you'll see a slight regression of her progress, although she's still better than when she started. Here, she had stopped doing her meditation, and therefore stopped taking the placebo, so her brain slightly regressed to what it knew before. The brain with the arrow at the blue area of 13 Hz means she's hypoactive in the sensory motor area, and thus has less ability to control her involuntary tremors. In this brainwave pattern, Michelle has less energy to control her body. You can also see the red areas circled again in the bottom of the scan, returning in higher range beta, which correlate with her anxiety. By her June 27, 2013 scan, shown in figure 10.6d, Michelle had gone back to her meditations at the beginning of that month, and her brain scan showed a significantly better brain. She had less overall anxiety, as demonstrated in red at the bottom row at 17 to 20 Hz. Now compare that scan to her next one, on July 13, 2013, after our workshop, as depicted in figure 10.6e. There's even less red, and the blue that showed up in her first scan in February, during alpha, indicating hypoactivity, is completely gone. Michelle continues to improve, and her changes are becoming more consistent. Michelle's new self. Today, Michelle hardly ever has any of the involuntary motor symptoms associated with Parkinson's disease. Very minor twitches do present themselves when she gets stressed or overtired at times, but for the most part she's high-functioning and normal. When Michelle is balanced and joyful, doing her meditations daily, her brain is working well, and so is she. From both our continued scans and her own reports, Michelle isn't merely maintaining her condition, she continues to get better and better. She keeps meditating because she understands that she has to be the placebo every day. John's old self. In November 2006, John broke his neck at the 7th cervical and 1st thoracic vertebrae while he was a passenger in a car that spun out of control and rolled at high speed. Due to the impact, he suffered a severe head injury as well. The doctors were quick and sure about his prognosis. He would be a quadriplegic for the rest of his life. He would never walk again, and he would have very limited use of his arms and hands. His vertebrae were 100% dislocated, resulting in spinal cord damage. It wasn't until John had surgery that his doctors saw the exact extent of his injuries. 2 days later, the neurologist told John's wife that his spinal cord was somewhat intact, but that his type of injury could have the same outcome as a complete cord severing. It would be, as with all spinal cord injuries, a waiting game. When you're caught up in the day-to-day reality of living in the intensive care unit, and later a rehab center, it can be extremely difficult not to get swept away by conventional thinking. When John and his family asked about his possible recovery, the doctors said that given the injury and the lack of return to any kind of normal functioning up to that point, they should begin accepting the inevitable. John would be physically handicapped for the rest of his life. His doctors hammered this message home, over and over, as a necessary part of moving on. But somehow, both John and his wife couldn't accept it. I met John while he was in his wheelchair in 2009, along with his wife and family, and an amazing physical therapist who understands neuroplasticity. They are some of the most energetic and optimistic people I've ever met, and we eagerly began our journey together. John's scans. Take a look at John's before meditation brain scan in figure 10.7. His first picture demonstrates quite a bit of hypoactivity. It's more than 3 SD below normal. John's coherence measurement, with such significant thick blue lines, is the opposite of our study of Michelle's Parkinson's condition, which showed thick red lines. This scan reveals a diminished capacity for different parts of the brain working well together. His brain here is on idle and has no energy, and he has limited ability to respond to anything for any length of time. He couldn't sustain attention, and his awareness was limited. Because of his traumatic brain injury, his brain was in a state of super low arousal, and it showed a high degree of incoherence. Now look at his brain scan after 4 days of meditation. In the first image on the upper left margin, at 1 Hz delta, he has some more activity demonstrated in red. In this case, it's a good sign, because more coherence is happening in delta in both hemispheres. Here, John is starting to show more balanced, dual brain processing. Because his traumatic brain injury is most visible in delta and theta, the hyperactivity in delta suggests that his brain is waking up. The rest of his brain in alpha and beta is showing more balanced activity and better cognitive function. This shows he has more access to control his mind and body. Now view figure 10.8. The blue color starting from about the middle of the second row and to the end of the bottom row once again indicates that John has no alpha or beta brain waves. This blue color distributed throughout the alpha and beta realms in the left and right hemispheres suggests that he's vegetating and working on limited resources. The blue shows less cognitive ability and less capacity to control his body. John's mind is just not there. After 4 days of meditation, 90% of John's brain has returned back to normal, as shown by all the green. That's pretty good. He still has some hypoactivity in his left hemisphere, where the arrows are pointing, indicating some problems with verbal skills and expressing himself, but it's still so much better than his first scan. John continues to do his meditations, and his brain continues to show more energy, more balance and more coherence. John has regained access to the latent neuropathways that were there before. His brain woke up, remembered how to work again, and now has the energy to work better. John's new self. John stood up at the end of our February 2013 event. He has regained full control of his bowels and his bladder. To date, he is now standing in a more normal and integrated posture. His movements are more coordinated. The frequency, intensity, and duration of his spastic tremors have diminished considerably. He's even doing a total gym workout on a regular basis thanks to the help of his amazing therapist, B. Jill Runyon, director of Synapse Center for Neuro Reactivation in Driggs, Idaho, who also studies my work and has the skills and unlimited mind to challenge John by setting up the right conditions. His unassisted vertical squat exercises have progressed from a 10-degree angle to a 45-degree angle. John is now in complete control of lowering his body to a seated position. He can also perform a specific physical therapy exercise that involves loading his leg and torso muscles and pushing a sled away from his body with resistance. John is now going from lying face down to supporting himself on all fours, completely under his own power, and he's now starting to crawl. Just months after the workshop, John astounded his medical team with all of his improvements in cognitive functioning. His advances exceeded anything any of the specialists had ever seen in a spinal cord injury patient. It was as if John finally woke up, and his scans showed that he now has more access to his brain and body. John is still demonstrating more control over dormant areas of his brain and body, because he now has more capacity to regulate his body. John's overall integration and coordinated movement patterns progressed considerably, enabling him to sit up at a table unassisted, with his feet planted on the floor. John's fine motor skills improved to the point where he can now hold a pen and sign his name, use a smartphone to send a text message, grip the steering wheel to drive, and hold a regular toothbrush. His cognitive changes demonstrate more self-confidence and greater inner joy. He has a much greater sense of humor and is more aware than ever. During the summer of 2013, John was able to go on a whitewater rafting trip, where he held himself unassisted in a raft for 6 hours a day and slept in a tent on the ground. He managed to live in the Idaho wilderness, away from contact with the outside world for 7 days and 6 nights. He couldn't have done this a year ago. Every time John and I talk, he always says the same thing. Dr. Joe, I have no idea what's happening. I always give him the same response. The moment you know what's happening, John, it's all over. The unknown is beyond our comprehension. Welcome it. I'd like to make one final point about John's case. Everyone knows that a spinal cord injury doesn't heal with typical conventional approaches. I'm sure that it's not matter that's changing matter for John. That is, it's not chemistry or molecules that are altering his damaged spinal cord. From a quantum perspective, he'd have to be in a coherent frequency of heightened energy that would have to consistently lift or entrain matter to a new mind. He'd have to display an elevated energy or wave that vibrates at a frequency faster than matter, combined with a clear intention, in order to alter the particles of matter. So it's energy which is the epiphenomenon of matter that is rewriting the genetic program and healing his spinal cord.